Hello, welcome to 2017 in GM Tips. GM Rick here, wishing you a very wonderful 2017. It was a lot of fun. Ended 2016 in a great way. Got to go to Stan Lee's MYNE. Thank you to GM Andy on that one and getting to go there. And so I wanted to ring in this year, digging into a lot deeper topics with each GM tips I do. So don't mind me, I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit to get what I need here. So, in looking at what can we do to help GMs to keep from burning out, I want to dive into different types of campaign areas and environments you can run when you're running a campaign. And so we're going to go across things over the next few weeks, like the desert, the jungle, the cold, the tundras, some of the areas that are a little less explored by most GMs. Most GMs love the pan-Euro type of settings where it's much more lush and fertile environments where there's developed cultures that are used to having a high level of resources available to them. Not all GMs run those, but a lot of them do. And so this idea came from one of my folks that I know on the Pathfinders group in Facebook, and I really appreciate him bringing up the fact that a lot of campaigns get boring that way, and that they don't explore other cultures and other type of environments. So, in dedication of him and what he and I talked about, we're going to look at the desert today and the desert type of arid campaigns. So these are areas that are based in high temperature areas that have low resources, that are so dry they can't even support a lot of plant life. What is there is scrub at best, and that don't have a lot of water sources, or maybe a couple rivers or lakes or inner seas that they have available to them. They may have some oases, but overall they are a very foreboding and bleak and desolate area. Now, and looking at the settings that are already available to you, I picked 4 settings that a lot of people like to run. And so we're going to hit 2 D&D settings. We're going to hit a Numenera setting. Yes, we are doing Numenera. And also we're going to hit 2 settings in Pathfinder. So what are these settings? Well, let's start with Numenera. We'll start with Monty Cook and Shanna's system from Monty Cook Games, and that is Numenera. And so Numenera has several deserts across it in the Great Beyond. Methunis, the Cold Desert, Arid Kalum, the Cloud Crystal Skyfields, Decenati, and the Jagged Wastes, the Lost Sea, the Amorphous Fields are all deserts or desert-like arid areas that could be cold arid or warm arid on Numenera. And so you do have those available to you when you're running to go into more of a desert-like condition. Um, for D&D, let's start with Greyhawk, one of the oldies but goodies. You've got the Sea of Dust and the Dry Steppes that you could base an adventure in, or around, or near. In Faerun, there's the Anarok Desert, the Desert's Mouth Mountain, the Kalim Desert, or Kalim Shan, which would be a nice one because it's a whole country that is set around that. The Plains of Purple Dust, the Bandit Wastes or Endless Wastes, or the Tortured Land, or Sayadar. There's a couple of them that are in those realms that are available to you, so keep that in mind. Now, if you're playing Pathfinder setting, there's the Southlands. Love the Southlands by Kobold Press. That's part of the Midgard worlds. And the deserts in there are the Crescent and the Sarkland deserts that are the 2 most prominent in the Southlands, as you can see them. Very large deserts surrounding other jungle cultures. In the Inner Sea and Galarian, there is the Kelishite areas, so the Kadira, and then you've got Kazmaron, which also has some deserts in it. You have some desert kingdoms in Katapesh, Syrian, in Thuvia, and in Rahadun. So There are a lot of realms available to you if you don't want to create your own and do your own homebrew. You may do your own homebrew and design your own, and that's wonderful too. Keep in mind, there's a couple things as you go into the deserts and the desert kingdoms. Number one, they are resource light. And what do I mean by that? They may have gold and jewels and other things, but when it comes to food, water, and other types of sustenance, they are much more challenged. The populations are not near as large, except in the major cities where they're able to grow or import goods to keep their situation ongoing and have food stores. Otherwise, they are very resource challenged areas when it comes to food and water. And those are two vital things. When you think about a desert campaign and an arid campaign, two of the largest dangers are starving to death, but even more, dehydration. And dehydration is the death of many a character and a player or an NPC in the desert, as you'll see as you venture into some of the harsher areas and you find lots of bleached skeletons or desiccated corpses. They dry out and they actually overheat and die of heat exhaustion out in these areas. And the subtle scary part about it, as we know as human beings in real life, if you go into a desert, dying is a slow and almost unnoticeable process at first. You're well into the process by the time you start to feel it. And so keep in mind for characters, that's a huge challenge. Um, whether it's sci-fi with things like Star Wars Tatooine, or whether it is another type of desert thing like you've seen on Star Trek and some of the other ones where they land on a desert world, there ain't much. That's how it is, and it's very challenging. And there's a lot of things, as you remember, a second hazard is the desert claims its own. The shifting sands, the sandstorms have claimed many an empire and many a city. That's why they are so um, ripe of a fruit that somebody wants to pick, because there's so much lost knowledge in these areas. Maybe it was a Holocaust event like with the Anorak Desert, or some other events where something went wrong and caused the desert to occur. Or maybe it's because there was a shift in climate. Or maybe an empire depleted the resources like locusts. They ended up just depleting the land and it turned into a bleak desert after that. Who knows the reason why the deserts occur? They just do. The conditions are right. And whole empires have been lost to them. And so, whether it's a modern day one where you're running in the modern day Gobi Desert or something like that, or in Egypt, or it's a Star Age one where you're going onto that world and maybe they went through a major Holocaust event that caused the bleak deserts and has radiation and other things that are a danger, or it's a medieval campaign. It's a fantasy based campaign where an empire grew up and then was lost. Maybe it was caused by some creature or some race that caused a cataclysm in that empire, or it was a mage gone wrong, or maybe it was just a shift in climate. These leave a lot behind, a lot of rich treasures, and make for great adventures. A good, for instance, if you look at Pathfinder, they have the mummy's mask. It is centered around a lost pharaoh and his empire, and what was left behind, and the major relical things that are out there in some of those places. There's a reason why they're still there in most cases. They're hard to get to. It causes a lot of strain on a party to try to get out to those areas where this knowledge is hidden. And there's huge dangers involved. Maybe it's the listless dead, or it's some sort of a worm or creature, or a div, or a jinn, or a salamander, or some other type of creature out here that is guarding that lost knowledge. Keep those things in mind. As a GM, it just enriches your ability to draw your characters into an adventure and also present the obstacles to them, because you have the environment. You have things like quicksand. Yes, they have dry quicksand out in those deserts. It may be an ant lion that's under the earth that's eating things, or some other dust digger that eats creatures. Maybe it's a worm, so some sort of a purple worm or other type of sandworm that eats things. Maybe it's a old red dragon or a black dragon that lives in the desert. Maybe it's something else. But whatever motivates and brings these things in, those challenges are there from the sheer adventuring during the day, which is hugely frowned upon, to the races the desert, things like out of the Mummy movies where you have the half scorpion people, this like the Scorpion King. They call them Geradables in Pathfinder or D&D if you want to convert them over there to five, or to Dungeon World or 13th Age. You can convert all these things over, or GURPS. You can take these things over into these systems and make different races that are available. The Catfolk Empire, so the goddess Bastet or Bast has its folk. In here, the folk that they call the race in here in Kobold Press is an interesting race for the uh, the uh, the name. Let's see. Hang on here. It is the Nkosi. So they're cat folk type of people, and they're just simple cat folks in Pathfinder, but they're the Nkosi in there. You have a lot of different elements and races. So even for your characters, they can be a race that's something unique. So maybe it's a rock troll, or a half giant, or a Goliath, or a some sort of an alien from there, like a Kasathi in the Pathfinder books that live in the desert, or the cat folk, or the lizard men, or the snake serpent folk, or you could go through a ton of different races. The gnolls tend to be in those bleak, nasty environments of the deserts. You can allow your players to play something other than the normal elf, human, um, half elf, dwarf. You can allow them to have a spin that normally they don't get to have in a more temperate environment. So keep that in mind. The gods and goddesses are different. The worship is different. The resources are different. Life and death every day is different. Where spices and coffee may be highly grown in the area and available, and food is not. There are some fruits, maybe some coconuts, and some other things that are the sustenance of life. Everything else is difficult to get. Maybe it's having the cactus drugs. So people take pleasure drugs, and they do it on Pathfinder, called Pesh, which is the paste of the different cactuses that grow out in those areas. It's all very different environment. Um, you remember Doom? They had the sand, and the sand, they all are the spices, and the spices from the sandworm were always mixed into foods and drinks to give them almost seer-like abilities. You can have a lot of fun with what's available in those areas. And again, where food may be a higher form of barter, gold, gems may be rich in those regions, and so their value is much lower. Where in a temperate region, they're very high value. In the desert, they may not be. So gold may devalue down there. Maybe it's something else. It's a more rare and precious thing that they want. That's a higher form of barter. So keep that in mind. It makes it fun for your players. It makes a different environment. Bazaars and haggling are common in most desert places. It's considered a normal custom to haggle and have all these different things. So keep that in mind as you're going through and you're doing these things. These are what's available to you as a GM and what's so precious. Think out what you want your players to do. For a long term campaign, what is it? Are they trying to establish a trade route that maybe betters the standard of life in a region? Maybe it is finding a lost treasure, or a lost piece of knowledge, or a lost scroll, or a lost history, or a lost creature, or a lost tomb and empire. Maybe it's a former pharaoh. Maybe it's some lost tech that went down in that area that caused the desert in the first place. So maybe it's a lost empire like Atlantis that went through a Holocaust, that your people have come down from space to try to get that knowledge. Maybe it's a trader or smuggler operation where they're smuggling some sort of a rare spice out of that region. There's so much you can do with this. Keep that in mind. And as you're creating, remember, the clothing's going to be different. It's going to be much more flowing and airy. They're not going to wear heavy armor. I'm sorry. You're not going to have somebody come down in stormtrooper armor and go around the desert unless they have some way to keep it cool. You're not going to have somebody in power armor like in Fallout running around a desert. It just doesn't make sense. You're going to die of heat exposure unless there's some way to keep water going for them. So keep that in mind as you're looking at those type of things. Also, um, what what you're working with in just the type of environment and the type of living day to day. How do people keep their food going? How do they keep their water going? How do they keep their sustenance going? How do they make their livelihood? Are they simple traders? Are they smugglers? Are they something else? Maybe they're trying to establish an outpost somewhere. And in this outpost, they're going through the challenges of living in an outpost situation with very little resources. So keep in mind that these type of realms offer some unique things. Um, Maybe they don't see much night. Maybe it's a day realm where day is that way all the time, and so it messes with your sleep functions. It makes you a little more delirious, a little more paranoid. You can have a lot of fun with these realms that you can't have in other places. Uh, and that's why I love to dig into them. I have a zest for the unique and weird realms like deserts, jungles, um, torrid, cold, or very cold, bitter winter areas because living is that you are eking out and scratching out a living, and things are not common. And again, some of the gods and goddesses worshipped, especially in a fantasy campaign, are very different than in the temperate climates. The color of skin. So, for instance, we're in a more temperate climate. You've got skin color of mine. Okay. Whereas you get into those southern empires, it goes from a olivey type of skin to a very dark mahogany skin. Or maybe it's a dark green or a dark purple if you're on another race or realm. The skin tones are much deeper and richer. And it's very different. And it's more, in some cases, it may be more tribal thinking or family oriented thinking because that's survival in those areas, and maybe their values are much different than up in a more prosperous empire where Machiavellianism is much more common, or power hungry people, or the church. Maybe down in these realms it's very different. They worship the sun differently than they're going to worship it up north. So keep these things in mind. There's so much difference and so much more richness as you go into these things. Make it clear to your players. Be very descriptive in your language you use in these realms. Make it really just overwhelmingly cool. There's some great pictures out at Pinterest that you can look up for desert fantasy or desert sci-fi or desert steampunk that are so different. And that's another one. I didn't even throw in Deadlands. So Deadlands, you could do a Wild West scenario or a steampunk Wild West scenario on a world where they're more in the 1800s age, where they're just getting into gunpowder or some other firearm. And it's much more the Wild West survival out in an outpost. You could do something like that where airships are life's blood because getting out of the desert using an airship is much safer than using a stagecoach or a train or some sort of a steam train that can overheat and is hard to run. So there's a lot you can do with these things. But remember, like I said, the dangers, the creatures, the value of things, the empires, are they much more kingdoms? Are they tribal? What are their rules of living? What are their rules of life? Going to be very different than in somewhere where you're really prosperous when it comes to agriculture and water, where you have lots of it. That is very different rules than out in the desert where people are trying to survive and thrive by just finding the next oasis. So maybe the oases are owned by the kingdom and you have to pay a tithe to use them. Or maybe they're free because the king wants to make sure his subject or her subjects survive. Or maybe the pharaoh doesn't care and they have their own thing. Or maybe it is a barterable thing. Keep all these things in mind when you build the area. And make sure you let your players know if they're from the area, they're going to know much more than if they're not. And so run some very different and rich campaigns this year to pick some empires and places you normally are uncomfortable running, like a desert or a jungle. And we'll go through some things about them. Again, the dangers in a desert are much different than a jungle. Jungle is much more into disease, and we'll talk about that on the next one. So I hope you really enjoyed today. Thank you again for all the people that followed me this last year in 2016. Really appreciate it. Hope I'm helping you with these. Trying to keep them short and sweet. Had to redo this because I had a mini GM meltdown on the last one. So I lost a little bit of the good stuff, but I think this will be a little more cohesive than the last one was. Have a great week. Have a great 2017. I look forward to seeing more of you joining and getting a lot of rich things out of these.